So I'm not sure if that answered the question, but might have been a few elements in there. Yeah, sure. So I'm John Smart. What's my background? I've been working in Agile for several decades. I created a framework called Serenity BDD, a test automation library. I've written a few books on Agile development. One's called BDD in Action, which will be a second edition coming out shortly. I've been doing software development since the late 90s, mid-90s, late 80s, in different forms. So I got involved in agile development in the late 90s, early 2000s, and then started getting involved with BDD more particularly when I started doing some work in London. So I started hanging out with the London XP practitioners and so worked with a lot of very smart people there who were floating around ideas like, well, TDD and BDD and practices like that. So I picked up a few things there and sort of picked that up and started applying it. I've been actually coaching teams in the XP practices and Agile in general. So I think the first team was in Egypt in around 2001, 2002. So I've been sort of coaching teams and working with teams for a wee while now. And testing's always been a really important part of that. So I've been sort of working with testers and doing testing for some time now. And in particular, I've sort of watched the evolution of test automation over the years, go from automating test scripts to sort of clunky big commercial tools to Selenium to all the JavaScript tools that you see now. So watching that with great interest, seeing things like the low code and no code tools coming out, and I've got some opinions about that as well. So it's all been so very interesting. What I do in my day job, I guess, is more to do with just helping teams in general, but also just bringing testers up to speed. And I run a thing called the Serenity Dojo, which is a program for manual testers and testers who are sort of new to test automation and get them up to a level of what I'd consider to be a sort of senior test automation level. Because I think there are too many testers who sort of held back by not knowing the right way to go about test automation, not knowing the right techniques, and they're not necessarily complicated techniques, but nobody shows it to them. And a lot of the people who sort of do teach, or a lot of the courses, the techniques that they teach aren't necessarily very helpful a lot of the time. So I try and sort of bring testers up to speed that way. So that's really sort of in a nutshell, a little bit of a ramble about who I am, what I do, and so forth. In testing, that's a really good question. I sort of drifted into testing from the BDD space, I guess, although BDD is not really testing. But when I think of it, I've been sort of involved with testing, and even very early on when I was a technical project manager, I sort of I was very closely involved with the testing activities and measuring defect rates and studying defect patterns and trying to come up with strategies of reducing defects early and so forth. So I've been getting involved with the sort of testing side of things for quite a while. And I think I was in Sydney. I think it was in 2011. I was just helping teams do test automation there. And then one of my friends, who was a manager at the time, proposed this idea of what if you could use tests to document applications. So what if you could use tests to be able to document features? And so we talked about that. And I thought that was a pretty cool idea. And I came up with some prototypes. So I got more involved in the test automation. I've been teaching test automation before that, since probably 2005, 2006. But actually getting into writing the tools and creating a test automation tool that would not just automate tests, but also document features. That was about 2011, I think. So it's sort of been a gradual move from sort of general agile and development and XP practices, so with a little bit more of a focus on BDD, the requirements discovery side of things, the getting teams to collaborate more effectively, and also getting into the sort of the other side of the coin, the testing, the test automation, and helping testers contribute more effectively to agile projects. What I like the most is what gives me a kick is seeing the evolution that people do in their work, in the way they work, when they sort of learn how to write really nice test automation or do really effective test automation frameworks, or that's not the only thing, but that's what I do. Find a lot of satisfaction when I see testers sort of go from this writing very rough ad hoc test scripts that are really hard to maintain, getting them to the level of having test scripts that take 10 times less, literally 10 times less time to write new scenarios, and starting to evangelize these sort of techniques and good practices, and seeing them sort of progress in their career because of that. So it's sort of about what I like seeing, what I enjoy most about my work is just seeing that impact of when you teach people a technique and they sort of pick it up and apply it and run with it, and then do it really well, and how it actually has an impact on their career. It's not just a sort of theoretical, aesthetical idea of you're writing nice code, but it actually has a concrete impact on, obviously, the projects and indirectly on their own career paths as well. I have lots of anecdotes. Just thinking of a good one. Just in the testing space and the impact of testing and the impact of thinking a little bit outside the box. There was one project I was working on, and we were doing a Requirement 3 Amigos session. And so the product owner came up with the requirement, said, right, well, what needs to happen is we need to upload an Excel spreadsheet into the database, and then it needs to send out a message into a workflow system where all the users of the system have to be notified, and then they need to be able to update the state of the workflow and change the state and make this spreadsheet. It was basically all about locking down data. They could upload a spreadsheet, but it couldn't be changed, and the only way to change it was to submit a workflow process where they could go into the workflow and modify the data, and then they had to have permissions and access rights, and it was a very complicated system. And one of the testers there on the team said, yeah, but why do we need to do that? What's the sort of reasoning behind it? So we were sort of doing the BDD approach of having 3 Amigos and being very sort of analytical and critical about requirements as they came through. I'm always asking, why do you need this? What's it for? And the product owner says, well, we need to do this in this way because that's the way it's always been done. That's the way it was done with the previous application. And so she asked, well, why was it done like that in the previous application? And turns out it dates back from an application before that, 2 applications back, I think it was, where this file got uploaded, and the file was basically a reporting file from vendors it's about a bus timetable system, but basically did the buses run on time. They had to upload statistics, and past a certain date, they weren't allowed to modify those statistics. And so they had this whole workflow in place to cater for that, because the original system, that was the only way they could do it. And so one of the developers said, well, why don't we just send an email notifying everyone that this data has been uploaded? And it turns out that's actually all that was needed. So this requirement went from about 3 months' work to about a day or less, because the tester was asking these questions. So I quite like that story. It saves the government department quite a lot of money just by asking the right question. I think that sort of shows when testers do get involved earlier on, not just waiting to test stuff that comes out the end of the pipeline, but are actually involved in the requirements discovery, the critical mindset that you have as a tester can really help to prevent waste much, much earlier on than people often think. So the main success criteria of an agile transformation, I guess, at the end of the day, it's, are you delivering value sooner? And can you adapt to change? That's what agile essentially is about. Can you adapt to change more readily? But generally speaking, that's quite hard to measure, and you don't actually measure that until a fair bit down the line. So the thing I tend to keep an eye on is little things, what I'd call proxy metrics, like, well, how often do you deliver working software? How early do developers or development team members, including testers, get involved in requirements discovery, in talking about the requirements? Do you have a testing team? If you've got a separate testing team, it's usually not a very good sign on an agile front. Do you have a UAT phase? Do you allocate time to UAT testing at the end of each phase? Those sort of things tell me that we're not really doing things in an agile way. So when I see teams that plan 3 months of work and then they have another 2 months following that to actually do testing, or integration testing or UAT testing or whatever they want to call it, that usually tells me that their agile process, their agile transformation, if you like, is not as optimal as it might be, and they're not actually using an agile approach of it's delivered when everything is ready, and that includes the testing. That's a good question. So like I said, if you've got a testing team, you're probably not being agile, because having a testing team implies that you're seeing testing as a separate activity, as the development's done, then we'll hand it over to the testers. I mean, I saw a post, I think it was today, asking about the different types of testing that testers should do. One of them was unit tests, and someone said, yeah, well, developers shouldn't do anything. Testers should do everything, including the unit tests, which is a really weird idea, because things like unit tests, and unit tests as done by testers is really, really inefficient. Unit tests are a typical sort of test that you want developers doing before they actually do the work. But just in a more general case, testing, if you're doing it as a team, then you're treating testing as a after the fact activity, that you deliver a feature and then you test it, or deliver a release and then you test it. And that's probably the most inefficient way of testing I know. It also sort of puts in a lot of waste and a lot of uncertainty into the process. So I'd say, how do you organize a testing team to be more efficient? Well, disband the testing team, get rid of it. Put the testers in the teams themselves, embed the testers in the teams. And instead of having a testing team, you have communities of practice, or community, or whatever you want to call them, to share and promote and learn and cultivate good practices. You get, instead of having a testing team, you have more experienced testers or test automation engineers who train the testers and help the testers bootstrap their automation or their BDD approach within a project or within a module, if they don't know how to do that themselves. But you could have a government, we'll call them councils, or communities of practice, or councils, probably councils in that case, of people who are a bit like a technical council, where you're overseeing the practices to make sure everybody is aligned where it makes sense for them to be aligned, and that good practices are being shared. But you don't have a team, don't have a separate testing team. So that would be my first advice: disband the team. It's being industrialized, which is not a good thing. So, generally speaking, what we're seeing now is waterfall type techniques being labeled as agile because it's much easier to sell to management. It's much easier to sell to large organizations. A very reassuring, structured, complex approach, which kind of gets away from the principle, the fundamental values of agile, which are being agile, being adaptable, being nimble, being able to adapt to change, and also having very solid technical practices. All of the XP kind of lost the war in the agile adoption, which is a shame because it's a far superior technique as far as delivering software goes than Scrum. It's just harder to do and harder to get people to practice. So for the small number of teams who do practice good, solid technical practices and encourage them, they're the ones who will be highly productive. They're the one, and when you can get teams doing that, practicing things like the XP practices, things like continuous delivery, continuous integration, continuous delivery, all of test-driven development, all of that good stuff, as much as possible. Then that's where you can get a lot of leverage with agile, and the larger scaling agile processes tend to neglect that sort of those technical practices. So there are a few very interesting ones to watch. I mean, Xscale is one that I watch quite closely as far as methods of scaling agile go, because the approach of Xscale is that you can't scale agile, you can only descale organizations. And you descale organizations by empowering teams to work together more effectively. And most techniques like SAFe and so forth are not about empowering teams to work together more effectively. They're about building a complex hierarchy of command and control. Even it may not look like that on paper, but in practice, that tends to be the way that it happens. And command and control is never very conducive to good agile practices. Now, that's an interesting question because BDD is not really about testing. BDD is about requirements discovery and collaboration. Testing is an entirely different thing. But how does BDD help with manual testing? I can say how BDD helps a manual tester. A manual tester in a team practicing BDD will get involved in requirements discovery and conversations about requirements and testing strategies much, much earlier than in a conventional approach. And they'll get more clarity about the requirements and also be able to give their input on the requirements and give their input on whether those requirements effectively testing the requirements before they get implemented, which gives the testers a lot more leverage than they do in a traditional testing approach. So with BDD, where we have this the 3 Amigos sessions or even discovery sessions earlier than that, where we take a user story or a feature and we pick it apart. Basically, we cross-examine it and look for the examples and counter-examples and business rules. Testers are very good at it. They can provide huge value inputting, giving their inputs at that level. So for a manual tester, it does change their role quite significantly and gives them a lot more leverage earlier on. It also can reduce the amount of manual testing that needs to be done, at least the boring manual testing, and leave time for more exploratory testing. Because if you do BDD well, and if you use an approach where you are writing not test scripts but executable specifications, and they're being built into the process so that the executable specifications drive the development, and there's very little automation to be done after the fact. So that's the way BDD works most effectively. And I have worked with quite a few teams where the requirements discovery process was basically a product owner would sit down with the team and they would update a set of cucumber scenarios to describe the business rules that they wanted to implement. And then that would drive the development. The test would fail, initially the scenarios would fail, they'd make it work, and then it would be done. And that works really, really well, but it takes a lot of effort, a lot of skill to set that up. But once you set it up, you've got a really, really high-performing team. And the manual tester in that role will be very, very involved in articulating the requirements and talking to the business and trying to make sure the business are expressing all of the edge cases and all the variations they need to do. It can also be a path for manual testers to get involved in automation, because it's the automation that you do in a BDD process is much more tightly coupled with the whole development flow. It's not something that happens in isolation. So manual testers can work with developers to make that automation happen. It can be a more gentle path into automation than if you just have to learn automation from scratch. The first thing I would recommend is don't start with the Udemy courses on Selenium or Cypress or whatever. Don't start with the frameworks. Don't start with automating manual test scripts, because that will lead very quickly to a dead end. Basically, automation is coding, and even the low code tools, at the end of the day, you're going to be thinking with a coding mindset. You need to understand development. And so if you want to get into automation, you want to start with coding, because automation coding is coding. You can't really get away from that. So that's really the place where you want to start. The trick is most books, most courses on Udemy, they're on coding are really written from a development perspective. And so they are a little bit more broad, and they look at things that you don't necessarily need as a tester. So as a tester doing test automation, you need to understand all the language features or the development approach and so forth, but there's a lot of stuff you don't need. And so it can be helpful to find training courses that are more focused on testing. The problem is a lot of testing training courses, sort of a hard puzzle, because a lot of the testing training courses written by testers don't have a developer mindset. So you don't have the reflex for writing high quality automation code. There's a lot of bad habits in there. So sometimes it's a bit tricky to find the right mix. But you do want to start with the coding side of things, get a good understanding of coding. Some people start with things like Python because it's easier. I'm not a huge fan unless you're going into a company or you're in a company that actually uses Python. I'd recommend just starting with Java because it's the most widely used language in the automation world. JavaScript's useful as well. It's fairly widely used, or TypeScript. But you want to start with an actual language. The second bit of advice that I'd give, I guess, is don't try and be like some of the CVs you see on LinkedIn where they've got 100 testing tools listed. You only need one. You want to start with one and master that really well. And once you know a tool really well, whether it's Selenium or Playwright or whatever, once you know that tool, it's fairly easy to transfer the automation skills. All of these automation skills are very transferable from one tool to another. So once you know one, it's very easy to go to another. The most important aspect of automation is not the tools. The tools are relatively easy. The most important thing is the mindset and how to craft automation, how to craft, basically to know what scenarios to automate, how to automate them, what scenarios not to automate. And that's what most testers, I find, struggle with, not the actual tools. It's knowing how to go about automating where you're going to get the most bang for your buck, so to speak. And that's basically, you need to understand how to automate requirements, how to start with requirements and turn them into meaningful, automated, executable specifications, as opposed to automating test scripts where the impact is much more limited. If you're automating requirements, you can change your whole team. If you're automating test scripts, then maybe you can save yourself a bit of time. So it's really a very different approach. And if you want to get the leverage, then it's you need to understand how to automate requirements and how to think in those terms. The last thing is you can learn a language pretty quickly if you put your mind to it, but don't expect to sort of master everything overnight. It's like any sort of serious skill. That's a journey. I mean, the training program that I run for manual testers, that's 6 months long. Some testers that have been on the program, they've sort of got up to speed within a month or two and have been getting jobs and good new roles in test automation. But the program, I consider you're continually learning throughout those 6 months and building up your skills, because it's not an overnight journey. If people are saying that you'll learn automation in a 40-hour course, that's not true. You'll learn a superficial level, but you won't have the depth of experience to be able to apply it. So don't expect a miracle solution overnight. It does take time. You do have to stick with it, because there is quite a lot to learn. I'd say that if you're a tester wanting to get into test automation, it is a struggle to start with. If you're coming from manual testing, it does take some discipline, and you need to sort of make conscious action to say, right, I'm going to learn automation. But it is definitely worth doing. It's definitely worth taking that step and sort of making the effort. I know work with so many testers who've sort of gone from knowing no coding at all and getting even one of the students that I've worked with, she went from a help desk and she's now leading a BDD transformation in the bank. So the career options that you get when you go down these paths are really, really satisfying, but you do have to sort of have the discipline and stick to it, and so really sort of stick it out. So that'd be my sort of parting words, I guess.